After a brief delay, Assassin's Creed Valhalla's first Season Pass expansion, The Wrath of the Druids, came out over the weekend, over 5 months after the release of the main game. The DLC swaps out a war-torn England for the bogs and hills of Ireland, offering a new setting, a new weapon type, several new armor sets, and a self-contained story set within Eivor's continuing saga. The question that stands then is whether or not this new content is able to rise above the polarized reception of the base game. Does Wrath of the Druids fix the issues that plagued players at Valhalla's release, or does it just maintain the status quo?
Ireland, a patchwork of petty kings jostling for hills and pastures and green glens. My adopted Isle.
The Wrath of the Druids is built to be accessible no matter where you are in Valhalla's story. It tells its own, self-contained plot, with a new cast of characters and its own set of stakes. When word reaches Eivor that her cousin, Barith, has become King of Dublin and wants to reconnect, she sets sail for new lands once again. However, as per usual with these kinds of stories, what begins as a cheerful family reunion becomes something darker very quickly, as Eivor becomes entangled in the building tensions between the pagans and Christians of Ireland. As far as the plot goes, Wrath of the Druids has some of the most solid storytelling in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. One of the big problems with the main game was that it was split up into this arc system in which Eivor would travel to a region, gain the favor of the characters in that region, and then leave, never to return. Only a few characters actually had an impact on the overarching narrative, and the story as a whole felt very piecemeal and mechanical at times. Wrath of the Druids doesn't fall into this trap, as it is practically one large arc in of itself. The characters you meet at the start of this expansion stick with you throughout the story, and they are given time to develop and grow in ways that very few characters could in the base game. Eivor's cousin Barith struggles to prove himself in his position on Dublin's throne as he tries to gain the favor of High King Flann, who himself struggles to balance the many kings, cultures, and religions that were intermingling in Ireland at that time. All the while, the charming but mysterious court poet Kira aids Eivor in protecting her country, but has a few secrets of her own that weigh her down. All of these characters are well written, and their shared experiences over the course of the game have real effects on the people that they grow into by the end of the story. I cared about the people I met in Ireland, and I legitimately wanted to help them as best I could. Speaking of Ireland itself, the fact that the country isn't separated into unconnected territories like England was a huge plus. England felt a lot less alive to me on account of the fact that when you were in a territory, you would never leave it, and once you left it, you would never come back. It almost felt like a series of separate levels that limited my desire to go out and explore, which is so important in an Assassin's Creed game. In Wrath of the Druids, you will be traveling all across Ireland throughout the game's 10 to 15 hour plot, and the story makes the most of the map it's set in. The landscapes are varied and gorgeous, and it feels distinct from the regions we've seen before. However, I will say Ireland does suffer from that same feeling of wide-open emptiness that England did. While the countrysides of Origins and Odyssey were filled with NPCs tending to the land and living their lives, Valhalla's NPCs still feel scarcer in this expansion outside of towns, with the only life usually being enemies roaming the open roads. In addition to this, if you were hoping for more urban environments, then this game isn't going to satisfy that thirst. The only true city in the game is Dublin, which is colorful but fairly small and spread out, and instead the allure of Ireland is its glistening waterfalls, mist-filled bogs, and cliffside ring forts, so you really shouldn't go into this game expecting any dense cityscapes. Ireland as a whole shines as its own character in this expansion, and the game's story focuses heavily on the political tension that arises as two cultures assimilate to one another. The themes of religious and cultural coexistence that felt sloppy in the main game are more prominent here, and they're explored with a greater sense of focus and nuance. The Christians of Ireland use paganism as a scapegoat for the problems of their land, and the aggression of the titular druidic cult, the Children of Danu, only heightens this paranoia and ostracization. The pagans, meanwhile, find themselves struggling to uphold the ways of their ancestors in a land that seems to want to stamp them out. I will say that thematically, the pacing of this game could have been better. While Wrath of the Druids takes a couple hours to really hit its stride, a lot of the heavy themes related to cultural assimilation and growth are packed into the last hour of the game. The expansion could have done a better job of making these themes equally salient throughout the entire story, because the last act of the game really feels rushed in its thematic presentation. There were like 3 different points where I thought the game was going to end, and in true Assassin's Creed fashion, a mystical MacGuffin does weasel its way into the story in the last 20 minutes in a way that was engaging, but was narratively sloppy. Still, I did find the ending to be satisfying, and I believe it did a good job of sticking to the themes it explores much better than the base game. This doesn't take video game stories to new heights, but I found that the plot and the environments came together to provide a very engaging experience.
I owe your family my life.
And what a life we had. I have fond memories of you and I slipping out to hunt.
In dead of night. Stars in the sky.
Assassin's Creed Valhalla's gameplay as a whole has its ups and downs, and I'm not going to talk about all of them here because I'm just trying to review the expansion, not the entire game. However, there are some important improvements that the Wrath of the Druids makes, along with some pretty glaring things it failed to improve on that have really needed a fix. As far as combat goes, everything is mostly the same, however a new weapon type was added, which are the sickle swords. I wanted to get the full Wrath of the Druids experience, and so I played through the whole game with a sickle in each hand, and I enjoyed what they added to the game. The sickles allow you to strike fast and chip away at enemy health, and it was a fun new way to play compared to my usual heavy axe build. The animations for the sickle swords are noticeably more grounded than a lot of the other weapons for the base game. I didn't like how cartoonish Eivor would look when swinging an axe or a hammer in the base game, and I didn't find the sickle swords to be nearly as bad. There are 3 new abilities in the game, and 2 of them are related to combat. Those are Viking Salute and Irish Wolfhound. Viking Salute is a damaging headbutt, and Irish Wolfhound is the man's best friend ability, but with an Irish Wolfhound instead of a wolf. So I'm sure some people will want to experiment with those, but they didn't enthrall me that much, and I ended up just going back to the abilities I was already familiar with from the base game. Valhalla has arguably the most mechanically interesting combat in the series once you level it all up, with its Sekiro-esque stun and parry system, dual wielding capacity, and various abilities to play around with. But it has been held back from greatness by its lack of impact, ugly animations, bad camera placement, and dull enemy archetypes. Wrath of the Druids does take steps in the right direction, but its improvements aren't enough to really transform the combat in a way that will sway anybody who didn't like it before. Stealth, however, is a different story all on its own, because it is terrible in the main game, and this expansion did not fix it. The enemy detection system is fairly broken, with the detection ring really not having any status between complete obliviousness and everybody in a camp knowing your exact location. Also, the cloak system is terrible, and the fact that Eivor throws off the cloak in combat or when swimming is still an atrocious decision that makes absolutely no sense. It is incredibly inconsistent and it looks terrible. It's just one of those things that really isn't an argument. No one I've seen wants this system to work the way it does, everybody hates it, and it makes no sense that it got in the game at all, let alone failed to have any sort of fix nearly half a year into the game's lifespan. But with all this combined, the problem with the stealth is that it just doesn't work consistently, and it doesn't feel good to play. Detection is all over the place, the chain assassinate feature doesn't work nearly as well as it did in Origins, and enemy placement and world design just don't feel tailored for stealth. This game does add smoke arrows, which are basically smoke bombs, and they are great, but they suffer from this game's bizarre decision-making when it comes to stealth. The smoke usually blinds everyone within it, but sometimes I would smoke out a group only for one single guy in the center not to be blinded, for some reason unknown to me, meaning I would be in combat and I can't assassinate anyone silently in the smoke. And, absurdly, when you upgrade the smoke, it becomes flammable, which would be fine if it still blinded the enemies, but it doesn't. If you fire a level 2 smoke arrow near fire, that becomes a bomb for absolutely no reason. Sometimes I wouldn't see a torch in the corner and I'd fire my smoke arrow at a group and it would just explode, leading 5 angry Irish bandits looking my way. I have no idea why the best stealth addition to the game got worse after the upgrade, but it fits with the game's general approach to stealth, which is try to not make it make any sense. But stealth rant aside, the game is also lacking a little bit when it comes to the activities outside of the main plot. The side content in this game includes a couple Drengr fights, a legendary animal, some cairns, some combat trials, and those weird sacrificial altars that want fish for you or other random objects for some reason. It's not like this isn't substantial, there's a lot there, but there's no flighting, there's no orlog, and none of those quirky, self-contained stories out in the world, and those would have been nice to see because they might have added to the feel of Ireland itself. As far as content goes overall, however, the main game and the side content are definitely robust enough to warrant being a full-on expansion, and I feel like I got my money's worth. One new side activity is the Dublin trading system, which sees Eivor traveling to trading posts around Ireland, taking them over and taking on trade contracts to Dublin. The system is simple and maybe a little too easy, but the rewards are really cool, and it kept me engaged. There are a ton of new armor sets that you can get from this trading system, and I like all the new perks and cosmetics offered. Now, the main game was also littered with bugs, and I didn't run into anything big, like quests not showing up like they did for me in England. However, there is this super annoying glitch where whenever you do a slide attack, the game continues to morph the ground beneath you and play the sliding sound effect indefinitely. And if you play with the controller, this is extra annoying as it will be rumbling until you enter an in-game cutscene, or you exit the game and come back. Hopefully that gets patched out soon. Last feature I'll talk about is the Children of Danu, which for all intents and purposes is a carryover of the Order of Ancients system from the base game, and it works in basically the same way. Notably, however, only a couple of the targets actually show up in the main game story and have any real plot significance. It is really cool to travel across Ireland picking up clues to unearth the cult member's location, but much like the Order of the Ancients, these targets sorely needed more backstory and screen time, as most of them just show up in the world as names to be crossed off. If Assassin's Creed can make the process of tracking down targets more interesting from a narrative and gameplay perspective, then I think a return to self-directed tracking of targets like in AC1 could be a really cool direction to take in the future. It is also important to note that Eivor isn't acting as an assassin in this expansion, nor are her enemies related to the Order of the Ancients or the Templars directly. The Children of Danu are a mysterious organization that infiltrated the highest reaches of society in their attempt to utilize the knowledge and technology of a previous civilization, so there are a lot of similarities, but at the same time they're very much their own thing and they have their own unique stakes. Purists who get upset when the conflict isn't between assassins and Templars might be upset by their lack of inclusion in this DLC. It took me 30 hours to play through the entirety of Wrath of the Druids, completing all territories, maxing out the trading system, and finishing the story. So with everything I've brought up so far in mind, who is this expansion for? Well, if you enjoyed Assassin's Creed Valhalla and you just want more of it, this is definitely what you've been looking for. Also, the setting of any piece of Assassin's Creed content is the star of the show. So if Ireland is a place you've been waiting to explore, and this time period speaks to you, this expansion really puts immersion in the setting on center stage. Ireland is gorgeous, and the storytelling does its best to give its own overarching interpretation of the political and cultural conflicts of the era. As I said, this DLC does have its issues, and there are a number of people who probably wouldn't like it if they pick it up. If you've been waiting on a big gameplay fix to iron out the bugs and fix stealth and combat issues, that hasn't happened yet. Also, if you wanted a more traditional Assassin's Creed experience, you're not going to find that here. It isn't what this story is going for. There aren't sprawling urban cities, and the Assassin-Templar conflict was left back in England. At this point, it looks like the Siege of Paris DLC might be a bigger addition in this respect, with the inclusion of a much denser city than anything in the base game, plus one-handed swords, and a well-known historical event at its center. When that DLC comes out, I'll probably make another video like this, and let you know if that might be more your style. Personally, I enjoyed Valhalla, and I got a lot out of this DLC. I was engaged in the narrative, the activities were fun, albeit familiar, and it was just enjoyable to play. I cannot recommend this to anyone who is hoping for some tangible improvements to the game before picking it up, because it still has a lot of the problems it had 5 months ago. If you were hoping for some big changes here, then Wrath of the Druids probably isn't for you. But if you were a fan of the base game, and you are excited to see what Ireland has in store, then I definitely recommend you give it a try. Anyhow, hit the bell and subscribe for more content like this, and let me know what your favorite Assassin's Creed DLC from the past was. Personally, I have a soft spot for Syndicate's Jack the Ripper DLC. I always like time jumps. Anyhow, have a great day, and do take care of yourself.